Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, October 5th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about Vice President Kamala Harris and her likeliest pathway to the presidency 1 month out from the presidential election. A lot of you guys have been asking, where does Kamala Harris really have this ultimate pathway to the presidency that lies through the path of least resistance, right? What is the easiest way that she can meet that magic number of 270 electoral votes? And for a while, we've had many conversations about the different routes that Kamala Harris could take, but I think there is one that is a really prevailing factor here that really goes to show that a lot of what we talk about in elections does boil down to just a handful of states and a handful of voters that determine the outcome of our nation every single election. Now, the way that the swing state situation has really unfolded since Kamala Harris has become the Democratic nominee for president, or the presumptive Democratic nominee for president on July 21st, is that this race really didn't change too tremendously except for who was leading in some of these battleground states. And what that means is, essentially, that some of these states, Kamala Harris is doing better than Joe Biden, but also that the same target states have really existed the exact same. Now, they have existed the same for Democrats, mostly. For Republicans, it's a bit trickier. I do believe the Republican Party has been always targeting the same 7 battleground states, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, but they actually wanted to expand a bit further. And so, again, in this video, we're going to go through some of the states that Republicans used to want to focus on, Democrats in a perfect scenario would also want to focus on, but really just honed in for the majority and chunk of this video, talking about it again, where does Kamala Harris have that likeliest outcome of victory, and where does it really reside in across the United States? So, characterizing all of the states that Donald Trump is going to win by a pretty substantive margin. Nothing really to see here on the Republican or Democratic side. These are all safe states for their respective parties. Here we have it, South Carolina, Alaska, Iowa, Ohio. These are likely states for Republicans. I'm just going to go ahead and just characterize all those together. Now, the reason I think I wanted to point out that some of these states have been targeted by the Republican Party and no longer are being targeted by the Republican Party is because, again, when Joe Biden no longer became that Democratic nominee for president, states like Virginia and Minnesota were not on the radar for Republicans anymore. They were initially states that the GOP wanted to invest in, right? Democrats had opened field offices in many of the battleground states, and so did Republicans, but Republicans were the only ones opening up field offices that were really there for the purpose of winning an election in states like Minnesota and Virginia. And that's when you started to see many of them pop up. Now, don't get me wrong, Democrats still have offices there because the infrastructure for Democrats exists in the state well enough to say that they won there in 2016 and in 2018 and in 2020 and in 2022 and now again in 2024, likely at least. But Republicans, again, popping up these brand new Donald Trump field offices is really something that I think goes to show that the Trump campaign genuinely did believe for an extensive period of time at least that they were going to be competitive in these states. Otherwise, there really is no means or purpose of investing in them altogether. Now, what I've also left up here are all of the states that I don't consider to be likely or safe. So likely is anywhere between 5 to 15 points in terms of margin. Safe is anywhere 15 points or more. So these are really strong states for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And so at baseline, you might be saying Kamala Harris has clearly the upper hand. She's at 226 electoral votes. Donald Trump is at 149. But the honest answer is that it isn't as simple as that. Florida and Texas are 2 states that Donald Trump will win in this election. I have no doubts about that. I do think they will be closer than they were in 2022 when it comes down to the Senate race in the state of Florida compared to even previous elections, but also when it comes down to just the general standard. Texas and Florida were very strong states for the GOP in congressional races, very strong states for the GOP in the governor races, but now I do think, although Donald Trump will win them, we are going to see a narrowing down from 2020 in Texas and a slight improvement for Republicans from the 2020 election in Florida. At large, though, Florida is still very much a pretty strong state for the Republican Party in general. And so when you characterize those states in, I do think they're lean states, so they weren't going to go in and be looped in with the likely and safe batch, but here we are. Texas, 40 electoral votes, Florida, 30 electoral votes. Those 70 electoral votes really propelled Donald Trump to being in a point of contention, right? Without Texas and without Florida, he cannot win the election. If Kamala Harris wins Texas, she wins the election. If Kamala Harris is winning Florida, she's winning the election. There are very limited circumstances and probably less than a 1 or 2% chance that Kamala Harris could win either of these 2 states and still lose the election. But even if we are here Sorry, that made no sense. Even if where we are right now, Kamala Harris is at 226, still with a slight upper hand to Donald Trump's 219. The 93 electoral votes are really where you've seen the most investments from the Republican and Democratic parties, and that matters because these are the states that are again going to be those limited handful voters that I talked to you guys about earlier on in this video, saying it's these voters in particular that will be changing the election, will be determining the future of our nation and the future of governing in the executive branch. It's these 93 electoral votes that really make a difference. And so 93, right? 226 electoral votes for Kamala Harris, 219 for Donald Trump. Let's look at where Kamala Harris's likeliest pathway to victory really lies in. Now, I made a video just yesterday talking about the battleground state of Nevada, how I believe Kamala Harris is going to win that state by a lean margin, and how even the data on the Republican side is suggesting the same thing. But that still only gets her to 232 electoral votes. The remaining 87 are split across states in the Rust Belt and across the Sun Belt. The Rust Belt being this area that includes Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, really only a section of Pennsylvania, but the entirety of Michigan, the entirety of Wisconsin. The Sun Belt, though, includes North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, the southern region of the United States, where we've started to see Democrats really do quite well in some of these states, right? Georgia flipped for the first time in 2020, for the first time since 1992. Arizona flipped for the first time since 1996. These are states that had historically been very strong for the GOP. In fact, in the 2004 presidential election, you can see North Carolina was red, Georgia was red, Colorado was red, New Mexico was red, Arizona was red, Nevada was red, this entire southern Florida was red, this entire Virginia was red. This entire southern region, right, was almost entirely Republican. It was the West Coast and then this, connected East Coast and the Rust Belt that was voting for Democrats then. But now we're starting to see Democrats really make a play for a lot of these states. Why? Because populations are growing and booming in these states with Democratic voters. You're starting to see that voters in the suburban areas that have been in states like Georgia and Arizona and North Carolina for a long time, decades even, are now switching away from the GOP. And all around here, you're seeing it go back and forth, swing between Democrats and Republicans because these states are competitive inherently. The Rust Belt, same thing. But the Rust Belt was actually more recently competitive with the day and age of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Now, Al Gore, John Kerry, they faced their own set of challenges winning those states, but they still won them. Right? Hillary Clinton is the only Democrat in the past 28 years who has not won any of these three states on the presidential map. And that's important, right? It's something you keep in mind when you look at the 2016 performance. But it isn't just that Hillary Clinton lost the states. It was that Donald Trump was uniquely electable in said states and uniquely pushed away a lot of voters in Arizona and Georgia and North Carolina. With that being said, Donald Trump did win all 6 of these states that have yet to be characterized in 2016. Joe Biden won 5 out of the 6 in the last election. So again, swinging is really in the name of many of these battlegrounds. Now, at face value, too, what Kamala Harris needs, it's just numbers, right? It really just is, where does she get the boost in the electoral vote count, and what is the easiest pathway to do so? She could reasonably win all of these battleground states, but a month out, where is it that she has the best possible way of doing so and the highest likelihood of doing so? And allow me to explain. The first thing I'd start off with is by saying that the state the Democrats have invested the most amount of money in, the state of Pennsylvania, would need to be one of those states that Kamala Harris wins. Whether she wins it by 1 point, 2 points, 3 points, she needs to win Pennsylvania. Those 19 electoral votes, what we know is that if Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania based on voting trends across the country, his chances of victory are 94% if he wins Pennsylvania. So if you see Donald Trump win Pennsylvania on election night, chances are he's winning the election and it's wraps. It's the second Trump term. On the flip side, it's a very high likelihood that Kamala Harris wins the election if she wins the state of Pennsylvania as well. Nevada, Pennsylvania are the 2 states where I start to see, again, this pathway of least resistance and the likeliest pathway to Kamala Harris being the next president of the United States. Now, Donald Trump, of course, would counteract this. Of course, he would probably win the state of North Carolina in a circumstance where we're talking about what is the most reasonable outcome at this point in terms of her chance of victory. And I do think North Carolina, we will see what the true impact is. Over the past 2 months, the heavy investments from the Republican Party, Donald Trump, same thing with the Democrats, it really could go either way. But in this scenario, Donald Trump wins it, 15 electoral votes, bumps him up to 235 electoral votes. Now, the next state I would say Kamala Harris would need to win is the state of Wisconsin. This is a state that Joe Biden won by less than a point in 2020, and Hillary Clinton lost by the largest amount out of the 3 states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that previously discussed as blue wall that existed until it didn't. Wisconsin is a state that has been very resistant to Democrats on the national level compared to how it had been previously, right? In 2008, it was a double-digit state for Obama. In 2012, it was a 7-point state for Obama. It was pretty strong for Obama when he was running with Joe Biden. And so to now see it become more of a competitive state, Kamala Harris absolutely needs that state. Now, Donald Trump will probably get the state of Georgia. in this certain circumstance too. I do think that Georgia is in a really interesting place where Kamala Harris very much could win it, Donald Trump very much could win it, but for a while it looked like Donald Trump was in the favorite to win that state for a very long period of time. I mean, it wasn't just recently. It has been very consistent that Donald Trump has maintained an advantage, especially over Joe Biden in the final stages of Joe Biden's presidential campaign. You saw that Donald Trump started to surge and gain and climb and gain and gain and gain in that battleground state. Democrats started to really slip and lose ground across it, not only in the presidential race, but many of the down ballot races here. The only interesting thing is, though, for Democrats, there's no investment here in the state because there's no Senate race on the ground. There's no governor's race. There aren't many competitive House races. There isn't really anything there for focus besides Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. And so overall, what we're seeing is Georgia may be reverting back a little bit to the Republican Party, and it wouldn't necessarily be necessary for Kamala Harris to win the election in this circumstance. So when it comes down to Michigan and Arizona, Kamala Harris can win with either of these two states as well, right? She's just 9 electoral votes away from winning the presidency. Michigan is 15, Arizona is 11. Either way, you're getting there. But again, when it comes down to the pathway of least resistance, you have to start looking around. Where is the math going to come from? Where is her victory going to come from? And for now, I would say that pathway lies through the state of Michigan. Now, it would be a narrow victory. I've been very adamant more recently that this victory for Kamala Harris in the state of Michigan probably will actually be less than that of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And it really throws us for a loop, knowing what we know about 2016 and 2020 and 2012, 2008. Michigan has almost always been that state that has been very strong for the Democratic Party and very weak for Republicans. The most recent gubernatorial race, Republicans lost by 11 points, right? The Senate race that's set to take place this cycle, Democrats are leading in the polls by 5, 6, 7 points. Michigan is a state, though, I do think, with a combination of decreased enthusiasm from the Democratic base combined with an uncommitted movement that actually takes up a significant chunk of the voting population in a battleground state that's reliably Democrat. I mean, you are finding that many of these voters that might have previously been all in for Biden, all in for Hillary, all in for all these different people, Democrats up and down the ballot, are no longer with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. And so that's also part of the circumstance here that does make Michigan a more competitive state than other states like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. It also means, too, though, if Michigan is going to Kamala Harris, that Arizona isn't necessary to win the election. That Kamala Harris's pathway of least resistance to win this cycle would be through Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. That's because largely they've all voted together for the past 24 years consistently. You have seen it time and time again. The blue wall, red wall, whatever you want to call it, depending on the election year, all you know is that it's a wall because it's a chunk of states that vote together. The total number here being 34 electoral votes, a massive amount of an electoral prize, especially when it comes down to every single vote, every single battleground state counting. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that is the path and that is the math that allows Kamala Harris to win the presidency with the path of least resistance. And even in this circumstance, you could throw away a battleground state like Nevada that has a less larger amount of electoral votes, right? The 6 electoral votes there, in theory, wouldn't be changing the outcome of the election at large. I just am a firm believer that Kamala Harris will be winning Nevada on election day, which means it boosts her up to 276. Now, the interesting thing here is that Donald Trump does make improvements off the 2020 election, and that's something that actually probably hurt the Republican Party even more because it would make them, it would show them that there were some levels of improvement, but it just wasn't enough. But even then, Republicans flip Arizona, they flip Georgia, they win North Carolina, they win Florida, they win Texas, they win Iowa, they win Ohio. So they're winning a substantial amount of electoral votes, a substantial amount of swing states, but it still just isn't enough to push Republicans over the top to 270 electoral votes. But Kamala Harris does win enough based on that reliant Hillary Clinton 2016 electoral vote count, 232, slightly adjusted with a new electoral map here, but it includes the swing states of Virginia, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Colorado, New Mexico, and Nevada. Beyond that point, too, it's just a winning of the blue wall. It's a winning of the white working class. It's a winning of those 3 states that Joe Biden was able to flip back in the 2020 election and that Democrats are looking to as a prime opportunity for victory in this cycle. Michigan, of all of them, would be the closest state, then Pennsylvania, then Wisconsin. I know it's a bit of a workaround here because in 2020, it went the opposite way. Wisconsin was the closest, then Pennsylvania, then Michigan. Now, I think Michigan's going to be the closest, Pennsylvania the second closest, Wisconsin the largest for Kamala Harris. And even at most, we're seeing a 3-point victory at most for Kamala Harris. I do believe there would be a slight reduction in support from the 2020 election, but I do not know if it's enough and enough bleeding at large that loses Kamala Harris any other states besides Arizona and Georgia, which on this metric right now are in a position where they are quite close to being Democratic states altogether. So this is where I'm at. This is where I am 1 month away from the election of the likeliest pathway forward for Kamala Harris to win the presidency. The path lies through the Rust Belt. It doesn't ignore the Sun Belt. Obviously, there's still going to be heavy investments in those states, heavy focus on those states, a lot of rallies, a lot of campaign visits. X, Y, and Z? Absolutely. But if you were to ask me today to make a bet on which one of the circumstances and scenarios for Kamala Harris to win the presidency is the easiest, is the likeliest, is the most reasonable, it would be through those Rust Belt states, again, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, keeping the blue wall blue. But beyond that, losing some of the other battleground states, still getting Kamala Harris to 276 electoral votes. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.